Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Dallas Baptist University. We are thrilled to be hosting this event with some great partners as we discuss Western policy towards Ukraine, Russia, and NATO. If this is your first time on DBU's campus, welcome. And for our people watching live stream, thank you for joining us tonight for this special event. DBU, our whole mission is to produce servant leaders who will impact the world for the glory of God. We have cross-disciplinary programs ranging from Christian studies to business to pre-nursing to education, sciences, and so much more. And we are really proud of our students, and we love providing these opportunities for some of our students to engage in this opportunity to hear from some of the best experts in the field as we discuss these hard global topics on where should we go and how should we move forward. The Institute for Global Engagement, which is a part of Dallas Baptist University, is a nonpartisan think tank. We are committed to engaging the public policy through a biblical worldview. We are a Christian university. We believe all truth is God's truth, and in that we can unapologetically engage the world for His glory. You may notice on the screen during the slides the daily briefing. The daily briefing is a tri-weekly newsletter that analyzes the news of the day. And so it goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's about 6 stories, some of the top highlights, and I would highly encourage you, particularly if you're a believer, to subscribe to this. It has a really unique perspective that takes a middle ground and really tries to evaluate the news. And so it's a great resource for you to take advantage of, and I encourage you to do so. As you may have walked in, you might have noticed some American flags in our courtyards and in our grounds. That was done by our Student Government Association, and there are 2,977 American flags represented, honoring the 2,977 lives that we lost on September 11th, 2001. I think that's fitting, some 23 years later, that we're talking about democracy and freedom globally today. And so thank you, especially given what we've just honored and remembered, for being here tonight and the significance of this event. Without further ado, I am so excited to introduce Liz Brailsford, the CEO of World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. She is such a great partner. You know, every year we get to host a couple events with Liz and her team, and they are always such great partners in putting on these events. So we are so thankful for her. She does a tremendous job. I would highly encourage you to check out World Affairs Council of DFW and some of their outstanding events such as this, if you're not already a member. With that, I'll turn it over to Liz.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you. Thank you very much for coming. And it is a special evening tonight because, first of all, we love our DBU partners and we love to be on this beautiful campus in this beautiful room. And we also want to say thank you to Brookings, the Brookings Institution, and also Dallas Morning News. Thank you for your partnership. We have David Kramer here. I'm going to say all the names in a second, but thank you so much for being here. I also want to say thank you to the Billingsley Company. They are sponsoring the overall event as well, so we appreciate them. And it's going to be a great program. We're talking about NATO. It's the 75th anniversary this year, so it is a critical year for the alliance. We're almost 75 years, so we're starting to set our sights on the horizon. And we're going to talk about our involvement from the United States and also the future of the alliance and what could potentially happen. So I also want to thank our institutional partners who help all of our work be possible. So thank you to AECOM, AT&T, Dallas Baptist University, again, thank you, Dallas College, Frost Bank, Harwood International, Haynes and Boone, Hillwood, Jackson Shaw, Cosmos, Lockheed Martin, NEC Corporation of America, PwC, PNC, Sidley Austin, and Vistra Energy. Thank you very much to our partners. I also want to say that we've got some students in the audience today, and we're really excited for them to be able to plug into our work and learn about international affairs. We're really happy each time you come. I also want to say thank you to Linda and Richard Schaefer, who make the work possible. And I also want to give 2 other plugs quickly, and then I want to tell you about our other NATO series programs. First is we have our 2024 Malin Award dinner coming up, and I think we have one of our dinner chairs, Thad Smith, in the audience. So thank you very much for being here, Thad. We're happy to see you. And then also, it is North Texas Giving Day soon, and that is on September 19th. Early giving has started, and when you donate to the council, it helps support our 4 pillars of our mission, which is public programs like this, our student youth education. Also, we support the State Department on their programs welcoming emerging and mid-level leaders, and we also work with the City of Dallas on their protocol and international services. So we really appreciate if you give to us, and if you do and give tonight, we will put your name in a hat, the proverbial hat, and you will get a free program pass if we pull your name. We'll let you know tomorrow morning, and that is if you give tonight or give today, and you can give on our website at dfwworld.org. Okay, I want to tell you about, very briefly, the other 2 programs that we have in our NATO series. This is part of the NATO series. We may have a 4th coming. That's not confirmed, but we may. So keep tuned on our website and in our newsletters. But on Tuesday, October 1st, we're going to be welcoming Daniel Coaches of the Hudson Institute. He's going to be talking more from an Indo-Pacific perspective. And so please do come to that. You can buy that on our website. That's October 1st. And then on October 4th, it's a Friday, we're going to be in Fort Worth, and we're going to be welcoming Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison. She's the former ambassador to NATO. She will be on stage with Congressman Jake Ellzey, and also will be moderated by a former General Michael Mosley. And so we're really excited to talk about that, and they're going to be talking more from a United States perspective. So go to our website to register and to give to North Texas Giving Day at dfwworld.org. Okay, so I'm going to move on to introducing our stellar panel. And before I do, if you can make sure that your devices are silenced, your cell phones, if you'll double check that, please. So for our speakers tonight, we have Fiona Hill. She is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe within the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. Fiona served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the U.S. National Security Council from 2017 to 2019, as well as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2006 to 2009. David J. Kramer serves as the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. Kramer also served 8 years in the U.S. Department of State during the George W. Bush administration, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. He was also Executive Director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy in Washington. Constanze Stelzenmüller is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and the inaugural holder of the Fritz Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at Brookings. She held the Kissinger Chair on Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress from 2019 to 2020 and served as the inaugural Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at Brookings from 2014 to 2019. And then, moderating the conversation, we have Rudy Bush of the Dallas Morning News. Rudy, thank you very much. And Rudy serves as the editorial page editor and vice president at the Dallas Morning News. He previously served as deputy editorial page editor, Dallas City Hall and investigative reporter, and City Desk News editor. Bush covered crime and the federal courts at the Chicago Tribune, and later became a national correspondent in the newspaper's Washington Bureau. We have a very accomplished panel. I thought the titles would go on forever. Now you have to prove yourselves. Thanks very much again for coming, and please help me in welcoming the panel.
We wanted to come at you from all angles there. Well, look, thank you all so much for being here this evening. I think this might be one of the most important conversations we can have right now about world affairs, and that is about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing war to defend Ukrainian independence, the role of the West in supporting our Ukrainian allies, and confronting Russian aggression, not only in the former Soviet bloc, but really around the world. And just a quick refresher for those who don't recall, in early 2014, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula in the southeast of Ukraine. After the Ukrainian people had pushed out a pro-Russian government. And then in 2022, we saw Russia again use military force to invade Ukraine, this time attempting but failing to take the capital of Kyiv. Ukrainian forces have since staged a bold defense, a bold counteroffensive, retaking much of their lost territory, but now this war has settled into a sort of conflict of attrition. We don't know how long the fighting's going to last, obviously. We don't know what the end game might be for all sides. And it's also unclear what the international consequences might be as a result. So with that, I want to begin by asking some of the foremost experts in this part of the world, people who've been on the ground, who've done the work for many years, a question that seems simple, but that actually has become much more complicated given our current political environment. And I'll begin with Fiona. Why, in your view, must the West be engaged in the war in Ukraine?
Well, thanks very much, Rudy, and it's a real pleasure to be here with everyone as well. I mean, very sadly, what we're seeing unfolding in Ukraine on a daily basis has taken us back decades, to the kind of decades that we thought we would never be in again. This is the largest war in Europe since World War II. And Liz was talking about the anniversary of NATO. Well, NATO was set up precisely to prevent and deter recurrence of the great wars that had roiled the European continent for the best part of the 20th century. So just by putting it in as simple terms as that, we've basically taken ourselves back in time. Now, Vladimir Putin would like to take us back even further in time, because what Putin is actually saying is that the borders that have existed in Europe for centuries, depending, he picks all kinds of different times depending on the audience he's speaking to. And some of you might have seen his interview with Tucker Carlson, for example, where Tucker Carlson was a little taken aback that Putin kept taking him back to the 9th century. And remember, Tucker Carlson kept saying, with all due respect, Mr. President, is this really relevant? And Vladimir Putin was saying, yes, it is, because he's basically saying that Russia has a right to the Ukrainian territory going back to the 9th and the 10th century, in a kind of way that we've seen many other European dictators and wars basically starting off in the past, making claims that go back centuries, not in fact looking forward. And I've got George Washington actually staring at me over here, and actually all of us here on the platform. And in some respects, this is kind of like a replay of the United States' own wars for independence. If we recall, after the United States secured its independence from the people I was originally from, with this British accent as I'm speaking here, there was an effort by Great Britain to take the United States back again. And if it hadn't been for the assistance of France and, kind of basically Americans re-emerging to fight for their independence in the wars of kind of 1812 and 1815, the United States might have found itself back under the tyranny at that point of the British kings. And in a way, Putin is basically trying to reverse Ukraine's independence. Ukraine's been independent for 30 years as a country. And if Putin gets away with that, then the consequences, not just for Europe, but for other countries, are really quite profound.
Yeah, what's next? Constanze, what's your view on why the West, and by the West I mean countries aligned with democracy, need to confront this aggression?
First of all, again, thank you for inviting us here. This is wonderful. You have a lovely university. It has a great view of Dallas, and it's nice to be outside of the Beltway, right?
It's wonderful.
It's really wonderful. So thank you for your hospitality. And it's also not the first time both Fiona and I have spoken for the World Affairs Council before. To answer your question, Rudy, it's a reasonable question. And it's a particularly reasonable question if you happen to be a citizen of the global south, right? And if you are, thank you, and if you are sitting there saying, well, why are we sort of less concerned about the awful war in Sudan? Why are we less concerned about the Chagos Islands? Why are we less concerned about the depredations by militias on people who live in the Philippines or in Central America? Those are absolutely reasonable questions, right? But the truth is, and I'm an international lawyer by training, and I've covered, and I was a journalist for a long time before I joined the think tank world, and I've covered a lot of wars, civil wars and genocide. And it's very rare in international affairs that the question of right and wrong is as clear as it is in this case. Putin attacked a country that had done absolutely nothing to provoke him. He invaded it, not once, but twice. First by annexing Crimea illegally in 2014, and then with a full-scale invasion on February 24, 22. He has been slaughtering Ukrainian soldiers, waging a brutal war of attrition against Ukrainian cities across the country, and in the territories that Russia occupies of Ukraine, which they are supposedly occupying because, as they say, they are ethnically Russian, people are being tortured and killed, and their children are being sent off for forced adoption in Russia. That's not just immoral, it's also genuinely and very clearly illegal under international law. And it is also, and I say this with some feeling as a former journalist who's been around places like that, it is also the first war in modern history where legal evidence has been collected in forensic quality in real time, right? The International Criminal Court and its international supporters have been collecting forensic quality evidence of the war crimes that have been happening here. And at some point, I think Vladimir Putin and his henchmen will be standing in front of a tribunal, and hopefully the one in The Hague. But that, in other words, to me, this is a question of upholding international law, right? Yes, I think we can be accused of double standards and hypocrisy in the West and as Western democracies, but if in a case that is as clear as this, right, you don't support the right of self-defense of Ukraine, I think you end up undermining any pretense at upholding an international legal order, right? And so that's one point. That's the moral and legal point, right. I would say. But my last point, if I may,
Please.
is that this is also about the security of Europe, and the security of Europe, and I say that as a European, and I say it with feeling, is, I think, also an American first-order strategic interest. It has been clear from the beginning that Putin has not just Ukraine in its sight, but the stability, the safety, the security of Europe writ large. He has made it very clear that he wants Europe to be a sphere of influence to Russia, and that he wants American forces to withdraw from Europe. And I don't think that is in America's interest. I can make an extended argument on that, but I think we can leave that for later.
No, absolutely right. David, you've written extensively on this, and I know I'll get a nice note from David when we write a Ukraine editorial that says we've got to send weapons or whatever we can do on our little editorial board to sort of keep the pressure on to have American interest focus on this important area. And just from your point of view, what's at stake here?
Well, Rudy, thanks very much for doing this, and Liz, to you and your great team at the World Affairs Council, excuse me, and the Dallas Baptist University. It's great to be here, my first time here at the university, and it's great to be reunited with two longtime friends, including this one with whom I went to graduate school. She was 3 at the time, and I was already 80 years old. But the stakes here, I would say, are enormous. And they're enormous for us because this is a huge battle playing out between authoritarianism and freedom, It is about depriving a country of its independence, forcibly changing borders, which we have not seen since World War II on the European continent, for all the reasons both Fiona and Constanze have cited. The additional reasons are, if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, even though the Russian military has suffered a terrible toll as a result of his disastrous decision to go into Ukraine, he will not stop there. Most likely, Moldova would be next, possibly Georgia, although their Georgian government, unfortunately, is already doing a pretty good job of folding under the Russian influence. But then possibly the Baltic states, which are members of NATO. And since we are a member of NATO, we would then be put in the position of deciding whether to come to the defense of Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia should Putin and Russia attack. And if we don't, that will be the end of NATO, because NATO members live under Article 5, which considers an attack on one as an attack on all. And so the stakes here are enormous, and it is thanks to the bravery and heroism and determination of the Ukrainian people that Putin has run into a tremendous buzzsaw, but the Ukrainians have paid a terrible price. The other reason I'll just mention very quickly is the world is watching how we react. If we want to help prevent Beijing from attacking Taipei, the way to do it is to help the Ukrainians, because it will get the Communist Party leadership thinking twice before it might take a move against Taiwan. It'll send a signal to the Iranians, to the North Koreans, to all the bad actors out there. They are watching how we, the United States, our European allies, our fellow democracies respond to this grave crisis. And so there is an opportunity to help prevent further wars on the Asia-Pacific coast, and that is through Ukraine, and it's thanks to the Ukrainian people.
I appreciate that. And Fiona, you mentioned the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, and I think those of us who watched it found it truly bizarre. It's really hard to understand the sort of motivations or end game of someone like Vladimir Putin. You've studied Putin for a long time. You've written books on Putin. You understand the history that he is referencing. What, as far as you can understand, are his motivations? What might his end game be? What is he hoping to get out of this confrontation with not just Ukraine, but really the entire Western world?
Yeah, Putin is really a quite unique character in many respects. I have been, for my sins, watching him and observing him quite close up for an extraordinarily long time. I mean, weirdly enough, when I first joined Brookings in 2000, that was just as Vladimir Putin launched on the scene, and giving us a great opportunity to study him closely. I mean, we forget he's been in power now for 25 years, and that's actually part of the problem that we have, because we, being democracy, we've changed presidents. In some cases in Europe, from my old home country in the UK, they changed prime ministers every 5 minutes in a couple of weeks. So Putin has outlived an enormous number of world leaders, and with those secretaries of defense, ministers of foreign affairs, national security advisors, people like us. And so in many respects, Putin's got the kind of advantage of longevity. And we've lost his plot when he's kept to his plot and been plotting this for some considerable period of time. And I wouldn't say that it was inevitable where we ended up, and maybe he himself couldn't have even envisaged where he would end up. But just by the fact that he's been in power for so long and has figured out how to outmaneuver people has really got us to this particular point in time, because he's started to think about his legacy. And David was making a joke about being 80 in graduate school. Well, Putin could very easily be in his 80s in the presidency of Russia, because he technically can stay in the presidency, sitting on his nice throne there, essentially, till 2036. And so I think over time, he can no longer basically separate himself out from Russia. And again, I'll go back to George Washington. George Washington was an actually remarkable and unique individual, because he knew when it was time to go. and he had the famous farewell address. He was determined not to become a king and to kind of basically replicate the tyranny that he'd just thrown off. He retreated off to his country estate and actually tried to stay out of politics. President Bush has done the same thing. I mean, he quite recently, when he was asked about his thoughts on presidential politics, said he has been out of presidential politics for a long time. Vladimir Putin has no intention of leaving presidential politics. His number one goal is regime preservation, which means his own preservation. And Ukraine has now become wrapped up in that. Because just as he was telling Tucker Carlson, Ukraine has defined Russia, he said, since basically the 9th or the 10th century. I mean, this is all actually pseudo-history, by the way. I mean, I'm sure that the history courses here at this venerable institution are actually teaching actual real history and, kind of fact-based history. But Putin has made up his own version of history, and he's put himself in the center of it. Because his name, Vladimir, is also the name of the Grand Prince of Kiev. Also, Volodymyr is a variant of that, and you happen to have Volodymyr Zelensky, named after the same Grand Prince of Kiev, who he says is basically the progenitor of Russia. And he's determined, very sadly, to make that a reality, to make Ukraine part of Russia again, and to give himself all of the graces and the favors and the attributes of a modern Russian Tsar. And that's basically what he was telling Tucker Carlson. So we're kind of, in a way, living out somebody else's fever dream. And during COVID, in the splendid isolation that he had himself, the kind of bubble that most of us don't have. I mean, many of us, took up a different kind of hobby when we were kind of stuck during COVID. Vladimir Putin came up with the idea of invading Ukraine. Yeah. And he had no one really else to tell him that this was a really very bad idea. So sadly, that's where we are. Yeah. We're basically living out somebody else's fever dream, someone's idea of themselves, their legacy, and we're all suffering as a result of it, and the Ukrainians more than anyone else.
Yeah, it's shocking. And then when you see the wealth that he's accrued, it's shocking. Constanze, let me turn to you for, I think, an important perspective that a lot of Americans don't necessarily hear a lot about, which is the European response to the war, the European political consequences of the war, and I think the support of the European nations, in particular German support, which has been both critical and misunderstood. Can you give an overview of how important that's been?
Well, that's a very generous way of putting it. I've written about my own country, Germany's response, and it is in many ways the same for the rest of Europe, although with different important differences. As a sort of defense version of Schrödinger's cat, famously. Schrödinger's cat, which, in electrophysics is both and is not there, right? And so what you are seeing is a European defense that both is and isn't, and let me explain what I mean. I realize that's a confusing way to start it. But I think it is fair to say, not least because I think we've all been close to these debates, that and in fact the Munich Security Conference, which is like the sort of elephant watering hole of the international community, security community, and it meets in February in 2022, met exactly 4 days before the Russian invasion. And I have been going for longer than I care to admit, because I too am 80 years old. And I remember thinking very despondently just about how sort of weak-willed we seemed and how unwilling we seemed to acknowledge what was happening in the world. And in fact, since this is a Baptist university, I'm going to tell you a story about a Catholic cardinal. I'm a Protestant myself, but not a Baptist. Sort of German version of Presbyterian. It's complicated. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm sorry. I digress. But there is the senior cardinal of Germany, the beautifully named Cardinal Marx, who is only in that way a Marxist. Is the Archbishop of Munich, and therefore comes to the Munich Security Conference and really takes an interest. By the way, he comes to America every year and visits Silicon Valley and talks to tech and biotech companies. He's an extraordinary man. And I sort of struck up a sort of a friendship with him because I sat next to him one day and said, what interests you here? And so I found myself in the year just before the invasion, standing behind him in the coffee line in Munich, and said, it seems to me the landscape is becoming grimmer and grimmer, isn't it, Your Eminence? I remember the title just in time. And he looked at me, and he's a very tall guy. He's built like a farmer, 6 foot something, bright blue eyes. And he turned around and looked at me in this coffee queue and said, Frau Stelzenmüller, the devil is in the world again. And I have to say, I was very struck by this. And it is seeming increasingly like an apt description of what is going on, right? This is stuck in my memory. And I say this because I remember in 2022, 4 years before the invasion, people in Munich, particularly those who had clearly been shown intelligence, and I knew people who had been shown intelligence in November and had believed since late November, and I can put it down to November 30th, when I talked with somebody in the German security system who had clearly been told stuff. I went out of that and said, the Russians are going to attack, we need to prepare. And I had the feeling that people's backs were up, that their spines were stiffened, and that they felt that they were looking at an inevitable machinery of death and destruction rolling towards Ukraine, and by implication, towards Europe, and that people were steeling themselves, right? So for those in the know and who had intelligence shared with them, this was not a complete surprise. And to that extent, people in Europe, I think, snapped into action, reacted very quickly, and the German Chancellor, 3 days after the invasion, gave a speech which he called the Zeitenwende speech, which is the German word for historic turn, and said, these are the things we need to do. We're going to be spending a ton of money. I'm going to fast forward because I've been talking too long. Essentially, in the 32 countries of NATO now, I think 2/3 spent 2% on defense as they promised themselves and each other in 2014. The Poles and I think 1 or 2 other countries are going beyond that in the direction of 3% or more. That is a remarkable shift in the European security landscape. It is real, and I can tell you that it is irreversible. And here is why. It is irreversible because right now the Russians are waging hybrid war in Europe, by which I mean not kinetic war with missiles, the way that they're doing in Ukraine, but they're committing acts of sabotage against physical and digital infrastructure. They are waging a propaganda war, and they're waging a disinformation war. And there was even an attempted attack on the life of the head of the CEO of one of Germany's major defense companies, Rheinmetall, that was averted with the help of friendly intelligence services warning them. This is extraordinary. We haven't had anything like this since the Cold War, and even in the Cold War, there were periods when it was a hell of a lot calmer than this. Forgive the invocation of, but the Cardinal made me think of that. On the other hand, and I'll make this very short, on the other hand, I would be lying to you if I didn't admit that our politics currently looks very divided and chaotic, right? There are populists across Europe challenging the democratic opinion space, and not just that, challenging and undermining democratic governance, and some of them are doing so with the help of Moscow and with the help of Russian funding, right? But not all of them are. Some of them are exploiting domestic disagreements, unhappiness, resentments of inequality of governments failing to solve problems, et cetera, et cetera. It's complicated.
Well, I want to get back into this because you and we've talked a little bit about what you call the hybrid war, and I want to get back into that in a minute. Let me ask David a question though about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has been something I don't think any of us expected in the way that it has unfolded. Ukraine is now in the Kursk region of Russia. This is the first invasion of Russia by a foreign military since the Second World War. You now have reports of Ukrainian drones attacking in the suburbs of Moscow. So just help us get some grounding strategically, militarily, what the Ukrainian response has been, and why it's been such a surprise.
The initial assessments of a lot of analysts, including the U.S. intelligence community, as well as those in the Kremlin, was that this war was going to be over in a matter of days or weeks. that the Ukrainians would be forced to capitulate, that the Zelensky government would be removed, and that Russia would take over the country. There would then follow an insurgency among Ukrainians, but that the Russians would win this war rather quickly. Here we are 2.5 years since the full-scale invasion on February 24th of 2022. The Ukrainians have regained more than 50% of their territory that Russia initially seized. They've essentially destroyed the Black Sea Fleet, which has been essential to Russia's naval security. They have reestablished the export route through Odessa that is very important for Ukraine and, frankly, the rest of the world, because Ukraine is a major agricultural and food exporter. They have developed an amazing drone technology capability, where drones are now able to reach places like Moscow, even Murmansk. It's quite extraordinary what they've been able to achieve while under relentless bombardment for the past 2.5 years. And we have seen tremendous skill and capability among all Ukrainians, not just soldiers on the front lines. Have there been some setbacks over the course of the war? Absolutely. There's no denying it. The so-called counteroffensive that was launched last year didn't live up to expectations. But the Ukrainians decided to move into the Kursk region in Russia that borders Ukraine for a number of reasons. President Zelensky has described it as a buffer zone to try to reduce the more direct short-term attacks coming from that region, possibly as a way for exchanging prisoners of war, where Russia would be forced to release a number of Ukrainians that have been seized in this war in exchange for Russians. Not that Putin really cares about that, frankly. And what is also striking about this is the Ukrainians didn't tell the United States beforehand, because they anticipated that if they had, we would have told them not to do it. And so it came as a bit of a surprise, not just to Moscow, it came as a bit of a surprise to Washington as well. And that reflects a level of frustration, to be clear, accompanied by enormous gratitude among Ukrainians for the support from the West, but also some frustration with the decision-making process that we have seen coming from the United States and European allies in terms of providing assistance, the military assistance that Ukraine is very dependent on. We have seen requests for various weapon systems over the past 2.5 years, frankly, even before the full-scale invasion. And our initial answer is no. The Ukrainians ask again, we say maybe. They ask a third time, and we finally say yes. But in that intervening period, hundreds, if not thousands, of Ukrainians are getting killed and wounded. And so our credit to the Biden administration, credit to European allies for staying united. I think there's been more unity in light of this. NATO has found its purpose again since this invasion. But we need to step up our game and help the Ukrainians not just hang in there, not just as long as it takes, but until the Ukrainians win and defeat the Russian forces. And that forces a change in mindset, where if you just provide them enough assistance to hang in there, that's not good enough. And so we have to provide the assistance to give the Ukrainians the opportunity to actually win.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since you brought up unity, let's talk about the upcoming presidential election. And so former President Trump has said, look, this war would be over even before I went into office. Vice President Harris is clearly interested in maintaining the sort of approach that the current administration has taken. Putin, meanwhile, has come out with some kind of an endorsement of Harris, which is strange in its own realm. So who wants to go first and help explain what are the implications here? Because there's a lot at stake for what could happen, how this, how the game could break based on what happens in November.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. Look,
Yeah.
I figure that these two are going to feel a little bit uncomfortable about this for various reasons. But look, I think part of the problem is that we, writ large, both here in the United States and perhaps more broadly, haven't really fully fathomed what's at stake here. And I want to actually just get us to think a little bit about the nature of this war in Ukraine. So it's not just all the things that we've already said. There's a lot more is going on there as well. We're kind of thinking here in our debates, not just around the presidential election, but just more broadly in Congress and elsewhere, that, obviously, and, I can't underplay this, that China is the real threat. That's the kind of pace-setting threat, and the Europeans will say that as well. But China is also a factor in this war in Ukraine, because China is actually supporting Russia. Now, why is that the case? It's not about Ukraine. It's about what China thinks, the United States' role is in this as well. And not only is China supporting Russia in this war, but so is North Korea and Iran. Again, not because of anything to do with Ukraine, but because they're starting to see this war, and they've thought about this in this way for a very long time, as a proxy war against the United States. Now, a year or so ago, a colleague of ours at Brookings, in fact, a colleague of all of ours here, Angela Stent, and another colleague, Daniel Hamilton, started to do a series of exchanges with various think tanks and counterparts around the world, including Brazil and South Africa and Turkey, and many of us were part of the discussions. And at one jaw-dropping moment, our Brazilian counterparts told us that they saw the war in Ukraine as the first proxy war between the United States and China. Not Russia, and the Russians have been telling everyone, Putin's been telling everyone that this is a proxy war with them by the United States and the West, but between the United States and China, and we were pretty taken aback. And they said that because of China's role in the war, and that they were more interested in knowing what China thought about the war than what Russia thought about the war. They saw Russia as a declining power, and in many respects as a kind of stalking horse, a kind of shadow for China. And so this gets back to what David said, and Constanze has also alluded to this, and so have you, Rudy, that there's a lot at stake in this particular conflict. And what Putin is hoping in all of this, I don't know whether he's fully fathomed and processed that actually Russia is acting in a way as a kind of proxy for China in all of this, is that he's hoping that this conflict will bring down the United States. Constanze already said this, and getting the United States to pull out of Europe, because Putin actually has tried to persuade a lot of Europeans that the United States is still occupying Russia, and Europe rather. And Russia is saying that the United States is an occupying force, that the Europeans are all vassal states. And this is also something that he's been telling the Chinese. And so as we start to fight among ourselves in the United States about the future perspective of the United States, we're kind of missing a beat here as to what's going on and how this is being perceived in the rest of the world. A lot of other countries are actually seeing this war about weakening the United States. I mean, even the Brazilians, who are, kind of, I think, our neighbors and our sort of, partners, basically see this as a kind of a decisive moment where the United States might not have quite of its grip in the Americas. The South Africans, kind of seeing this as kind of an opportunity, for regionally sorting things out in Africa and elsewhere. And so the way that this is playing out in our presidential politics is being watched extraordinarily closely. This is actually a test as to whether the United States has still got what it takes to be not just a global leader, but a kind of basically a major trend-setting country. And if, again, Putin gets his way, and this is, again, why he's trying to influence the election here, trying to influence elections in Germany or the United Kingdom or anywhere else, he will show that the United States is actually an incredibly weak country. And that was really kind of playing out in the debate, sadly. And, I think that we haven't fully fathomed here that, our future as a major power is at stake here, as well as, the future of our domestic stability. Because there's a hope that this will weaken, like the other forever wars, Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, the United States. And that's really what's at stake. And we just haven't seen that that's at stake in the election as well.
Yeah. Can I come in here?
Please.
I think this is the moment to address the theory that's currently very fashionable in Washington, which is that the Europeans should take care of themselves, and that China should not just be the pacing challenge for the United States, but also its sole preoccupation. In other words, that there ought to be a regional division of labor. And I understand why that theory has a lot of appeal, right? I, as a European and as a German, think that there has been an unhealthy codependency between Americans and Europeans and NATO, And it's been unhealthy for both sides, right? You've allowed us to buy social peace, especially in the decades after the war, when it mattered. And the Marshall Plan was a key element of that, for which, by the way, Brookings did the number crunching. This is our sort of historical claim to fame, which is one of the reasons why I'm proud to be there. But it was an act of enormous generosity from this country, and truly historic. And we wouldn't exist as a peaceful continent without it. Let me just say that, so thank you. But at this point, I'm the first person to say that we ought to be bearing more of the burden of our own defense, right? I don't think we can stand at 2% of GDP spending of our defenses. During the Cold War, even divided Germany, well, West Germany, spent between 3 and 4% under a social democratic center-left Chancellor Willy Brandt. But I think what we really need to look squarely in the face is this contention that America shouldn't engage in Europe at all, that it is a waste of American energy because America no longer has the resources to engage in two fronts, or to engage on two fronts at the same time. I understand deeply the appeal of that argument, but here is why I think it's wrong. For one, some of you who are in business here are probably aware of just how deeply integrated the transatlantic economic space is these days. I know that globalization isn't a popular term these days, but economic interdependence is real. And I have actually brought some numbers because I can never remember these. And no, I'm very bad at remembering numbers, so I thought I would read them to you. The US invests 4 times more in Europe than it does in Asia. Europeans invest 10 times more in the United States than in China and India combined. You have 30 allies in Europe compared to 6 in the Indo-Pacific, right? We are your largest overseas trade partner. And the collective GDP of European NATO allies is 20 trillion, that of allied Asia is 9 trillion, right? Our annual defense spending was 383 billion in 23, that of US allies was 140 billion, right? We have 2 of the 5 permanent seats in the UN Security Council because 2 of us are nuclear powers. And why does that matter? Not just because of this enormous economic heft that we have together, but because we are democratic allies, we're deeply economically interwoven. You have bases all across Europe that give you the possibility of power projection into Africa, into the Middle East, right, and against Russia when it matters. And finally, let me say this to you on the China point. If you lose Europe to Russia, the Chinese will take notice, and they will think they have the measure of America. And finally, I think that this debate that says it's only China that matters and a coming confrontation over Taiwan completely leaves out a huge part of what's happening right now, which is that we are already in a deep and very aggressive economic strategic competition with the Chinese. And with the Chinese interfering both in the European space and in the American space. One of our hosts was telling us earlier how the Chinese have been buying real estate in America, right? So the European Union and the European continent as a peaceful, prosperous, and safe continent with the enormous economic power that we can bring to bear and the regulatory power that we can bring to bear really are enormous sources of leverage in a conflict with China that is waged with economic means every single day, today, yesterday, and tomorrow. That is why it matters, and that is often left out of this argument. Sorry for making this in such detail, but I thought it would be helpful.
I appreciate that. David?
Just very quickly, there are, except for a few volunteers, there are no American soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have never asked us to send our brave men and women to fight this fight for them, but they do need our military assistance. It is with less than 5% of the Pentagon's budget that we have helped these brave Ukrainians do enormous damage to the Russian military. The estimates are that over 600,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in this battle. Tremendous damage to Russian tanks, to Russian fighter jets, and other military equipment and assets. This is, in a way, again, thanks to the Ukrainians, enormous return on investment for us that we are dealing with a major threat to global security. The last thing I'll say is, and forgive me if I'm too blunt and direct about this, but I have no patience for people in the United States or frankly in other parts of Europe who say, enough of this war, I have Ukraine fatigue. We're not the ones doing the fighting and dying every single day. It's the Ukrainians. There is nobody who wants this war to end sooner than Ukrainians, since they are suffering every single day. But they also don't want to live under Russian oppression. People talk about making territorial concessions. It's time for negotiations. We're not just talking about land. We're talking about people, millions of Ukrainians, and consigning them to living under Russians' influence and Russian control. I don't want to be responsible for that. I would hope our next American president would not fall for that trap either.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I want to get back to what Constanze was talking about earlier. I don't think people have a full understanding of this concept of hybrid war that you're describing in Europe. The sort of Cold War level of intrigue and interference that is happening within European nations. We know that there was an effort to interfere in our presidential election, but this is an ongoing problem in Europe. So maybe just pick up on that concept of what is happening in Europe and how is it affecting the political landscape.
All right, so let me just pick out a couple of examples. I was just in the Norwegian Arctic with the Norwegian Coast Guard, and the Russians are flying drones around Norwegian oil drilling stations pretty much every day, right? Russian submarines are checking out transatlantic internet cables and internet cables in the North Sea. They're also checking out seabed gas pipelines and oil pipelines, right? It's pretty clear why. In Germany, we've had attacks on the electrical lines that feed the trains that have laid low the train networks in all of northern Germany for a day, right? Because cables were cut. And I think it's been determined since that was actually a hostile act and not just sort of random terrorism or crime. I've already mentioned the attempt to take the life of the CEO of Rheinmetall. The propaganda and the disinformation via Russian-funded news sources right now is off the charts, right? And we have shut down most of the direct Russian news sources like Russia Today, right? But they are still working through legitimate or quasi-legitimate news sources. There's been recent reports about this. And I will say this, this is somebody who I once had to testify in 2017 in front of the Senate Select Committee on Russian interference in European elections. And at the time, I thought I did a fairly thorough job and a fairly hard-nosed assessment of what the Russians were trying to do on the basis of open source intelligence, because I don't really have contacts to the intelligence services, or not enough to do this kind of thing. And if I compare what I thought in 2017 and what I'm seeing now, right, this is a difference like night and day. The quantitative and qualitative intensity of Russian attacks on physical installations, on people, the attempts to buy people, the attempts on the information space, really on messing with people's heads and minds, is really extraordinary. And what's strikingly different today than years ago, Fiona and I have talked about this a lot in the past, European and especially the German intelligence services used to be very upset when they got nudged by the Americans or by the Brits to acknowledge what was happening or to attribute it to a hostile actor, especially the Russians. We were very, very, very squeamish about this. That has changed. German services these days acknowledge and attribute with remarkable rapidity, and it's because they have no other choice. It is the only way to make civil society understand what is happening.
Fiona, talk a little bit about other parts of the world, and David, jump in as you see a place. We know that Russian mercenaries are working throughout Africa, for example. We know that Russian military and mercenaries have been active in Syria and in simply sowing chaos and struggle in many different places, and maybe you can just put some context around all that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the case. And, one of the problems that we've had is, I mentioned before, Putin's been in power for such a long time. He's got a singular focus. He genuinely does, I think, get up every day trying to think of what he's going to do next. Where we have, lost the plot many times because we've got other things to think about. And, most of us are actually also thinking about our daily lives. And we're seeing,
feeding
very
our people.
sadly, feeding our people and actually, kind of trying to run the country, and that's what partly of our debates are about as well. And David talked about the incredible casualty rate in Russia. It's not just people killed, but also maimed. It's having an impact right now, by the way, because the Russian government has been trying to increase the contract fees to soldiers to go into battle. At one point, they were losing 1,600 people a day. I mean, again, not everyone killed, but seriously maimed and taken off the battlefield. And they've increased the contract fees 2-3 times, and they're not now getting the number of people who are basically willing to be cannon fodder. So this is actually having an impact. But what Putin is willing to do across the world, across the globe, in terms of sacrificing his own people, should also be giving us pause. And we have not been paying attention to all of this. As Constanze said, in the case of Germany and other countries, it's taken a long while for these patterns to become evident. But, we're really at danger now. You've mentioned the Wagner group, who have been active in Africa and really came mostly to people's attention when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner outfit, actually decided to march on Moscow and have his own insurgency because he didn't like the way the war was going in Ukraine, because the Wagner forces had been sent as cannon fodder and actually was complaining about it. There's, in fact, one incredibly gruesome video on Telegram where Prigozhin stood in front of a highly stacked pile of bodies of his own forces, complaining about the very fact that despite the amount of money that they were paid, his guys were dying in an unseemly fashion on the front. And that was one of the triggers to get him to march against Moscow, even though at the same time he was making an enormous amount of money as his mercenary forces were in these expeditionary efforts in Africa. But basically, what Putin is trying to do is look for all of the vulnerabilities and weaknesses. It could be in our electoral systems. It could be in vulnerable infrastructure, like undersea cables, for example. It can be in our partisan politics and on the internet, where Americans are always, tearing each other apart, or Spaniards are, or Brazilians are, for example. But it could also be in countries that are extraordinarily vulnerable, but have also laid themselves still open for Russians to be present. Mexico is somewhere that we should actually be very concerned about at the moment. We're always, kind of thinking about Mexico and immigration and the southern border. Well, Russia thinks about that as well, in fact. And one of our vulnerabilities, which again gets back to the myopic way that we talk about things in politics, is the fact that Putin has operatives running all the way over Mexico, because Mexico is one of the countries that still does not demand visas of Russians. We've seen Russian operatives get pushed out of Europe. They're landing up in Mexico. Russia today is actually also building up the RT, not just its English language or German or but Spanish, the news outlet, which is their propaganda outlet. Their Spanish language outlet is actually the most well-resourced and well-staffed of all of the outlets. And in fact, we've seen many times the effect of Russia today operating out of Mexico or elsewhere in Latin America having impacts here in the United States and also in Europe. So, for example, just as one additional example, when Spain was having the peak of its secessionist political trouble with Catalonia, the Spanish government got an incredible amount of evidence, in part thanks to Microsoft and other internet companies, that most of the activity encouraging Catalonia's and Catalan secession was coming from Russian language television, RT, in Latin America, in places like Venezuela and Mexico and elsewhere. Because the Russians are making use of the fact of places that we're not really kind of thinking about. We don't have our own coherent policies, or we've got rifts in our relationships. I mean, the Mexican government's often quite annoyed with us in the United States, and are kind of then sometimes willing to to turn a bit of a blind eye to what the Russians are doing. We need to work better, basically on our networks of relationships, and be much more attentive to the vulnerable places that Russia has moved into and some of the things that it's actually doing. The Catalonia episode is really quite a startling one for anybody who wants to read more about that. The Spanish government actually put out a report. They were shocked themselves that they had failed to pay attention to Spanish language TV and radio and print in Latin America that was being used against them, just with the pure goal of destabilizing Spain.
The reach has become shocking. We just have a few minutes left here, so speed round on this one. And I know no one on this stage has a crystal ball, and you all read very deeply, but we can't predict necessarily what's next. So just very quickly from each of you, though, how might this play out? And then as an addendum to that, what are you hoping for? And I guess I'll start, Constanze, at the end, and then come on down to David.
This is so hard because we talk and think about this every day, right? We've played this through in our minds every day from morning to evening. We wake up with it, we go to bed with it. We discuss it with colleagues within our own institutions, with other institutions. We keep checking and counter-checking what we think. And honestly, there are so many variables at play that I can only say, I think the likelihood of a swift and complete success by Ukraine is the least probable case here, right? I think we will probably do a lot to prevent a Russian outright swift victory, but the most probable scenario that I can see is a continued, long-lasting war of attrition in which we do not muster the energy to give Ukraine what it needs because we don't have the political capital for it. But Russia also doesn't quite have the political energy or the social capital to mount a full-fledged attack that destroys Ukrainian independence. I do think that if we let that happen, if we allow things to slide, if we allow path dependencies to happen, that will do a great deal of damage to the fabric of European and Western democracies. So I hope that we won't.
Yeah, and I think, look, on that note, and just based on what I just said as well, we have, really to up our game in our own diplomacy, in our own relationships with our neighbours and allies and partners. We are going to have to think about the way that Russia exploits rifts in our relationships, for example, and also in the way that Russia is using this war in Ukraine for all kinds of other impacts and goals. And, unfortunately, we're also seeing in the Middle East, which we didn't mention, Russia stirring the pot there as well.
Right.
Because we have Iran as a factor in the war in Ukraine, and Russia's very interested in having a much broader, regional war in the Middle East, because Vladimir Putin is in the chaos business. When the cardinal mentioned, the devil is back in the world again, Putin is actually apparently being called behind his back in Russia now the moth. Now that might sound a little bit weird, but in kind of Russian folklore and mythology, the moth is the harbinger of destruction and death. And so there's a backlash towards what Putin is doing at home, but it's going to take a long time before the Russian people, who have been so repressed and cowed into submission at this particular point, take any kind of action that might change the calculation. So what we have to do to get the kind of desirable endgame, which is an end to this war and this conflict that sees Vladimir Putin not succeeding in getting the recognition of his seizure of Ukrainian territory, we're going to have to change the global calculation. We're going to have to somehow persuade China that it's not in China's interest, basically for this war to go on. It's going to be very hard, I think, for Iran and North Korea, but I mean, we are taking some action now against Iran that has been sending missiles to Russia for use against Ukraine. We're going to have to get countries like Mexico and South Africa and Brazil and others to also want to put pressure on Russia, not just letting Russians, run around all over the place, carrying out all kinds of nefarious actions. Europeans have woken up to this. Japan and South Korea see this problem, to be frank. And we have, a lot of efforts on the part of Japan and South Korea right now to help Ukraine and to work with the United States and to work with our allies. And we also have to somehow get through this election here in the United States in one piece, because right now people are waiting around to see what we decide. They want to know where we're headed in the United States and whether we're still going to be playing an international leadership role. And so, for better, for worse, an awful lot is riding on, where we head in November and whether we are still committed, to playing, a larger role. And so again, with George Washington, looking, this kind of direction, the hope of the founding fathers that America would be a force for good and for light in the world is also at stake here. And the more that the United States looks in disarray, the more that people like Putin think that they can sow chaos globally.
Thank you.
I remain cautiously optimistic that the Ukrainians can achieve victory. I agree, not swiftly. It'll take time. Victory I would define as driving every Russian soldier off of Ukrainian territory, holding Russia accountable for the gross human rights abuses, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Putin, remember, has been indicted by the ICC, and making Russia pay, taking the $300 billion that Russia stupidly left in Western financial institutions, and not just freezing it, but seizing it. The reason for my cautious optimism is the reason that you both cited, and that's us. I have much more confidence and optimism, frankly, in the Ukrainians than I do in the rest of us. Putin is counting on us failing Ukraine, and it seems incumbent upon all of us to prove him wrong on this. The stakes, as we've discussed here all night, are enormous. If we provide the Ukrainians with the means they need, never underestimate the Ukrainians. Boy, have they proven a lot of people wrong. It doesn't look like this optimistic scenario is possible right now, but I wouldn't bet against the Ukrainians. And your point is so right. Many people think Russia has countless numbers of people it can send into this war. It actually doesn't. And it also doesn't have endless supplies of military equipment. And the last thing is the fear of escalation. I know there's been back and forth in the intelligence community about how real this was, particularly in 2022. But Putin's rhetoric, and Dmitry Medvedev, the idiot who kept his seat warm for 4 years, over a decade ago, their talk about using nuclear weapons is so that we back off, so that we tie our hands and the hands of the Ukrainians behind their backs. And so we shouldn't cave in. Let's remember, we're the United States of America. And we have warned the Russians, should they use a tactical nuclear weapon, we will respond militarily, not necessarily with a nuclear weapon of our own. They will lose Chinese support, they'll lose Indian support. I never put it at zero, but I really would caution against overstating the possibility of nuclear escalation. That's what Putin wants us to think. Let's not fall for it.
I appreciate that, David. Those were terrific responses. Now I have 4 questions in front of me that are all smarter than the questions that I asked. I'm not even fully sure I understand them, but maybe each one of you can field one that you find fits your area of expertise. And so I'll go with the first one here. How might the U.S. adapt its foreign policy toward Ukraine and Russia in response to the evolving geopolitical dynamics in Eastern Europe, especially in light of potential shifts in NATO's strategic objectives beyond 2024? Told you it was smart. Yeah, who wants to go with NATO and strategic objectives? Yeah.
NATO has adjusted. I mean, Constanze talked about how roughly now 2/3 either are or will be at the 2% of GDP spending on defense by the end of this year. NATO has found its purpose. And so I do think we have done a good job, but we need to speed up our game. It's delivery of promises that we have made to the Ukrainians. It takes too damn long for us to get the weapons that the Ukrainians need in order to have a chance. And so that's where I think NATO needs to adapt more effectively.
Thanks for this.
We
have time for just one more, and I think this goes mostly to you, Constanze, but others may have a thought. Thank you for speaking in Dallas. The writer says, Central Europe used to be the buffer for Western Europe. Now it is Ukraine. They are the hinge on the door to Europe. What do you think it will be? What do you think will be some contributing factors to how Europe will foster more solidarity with Ukraine? How can the average citizen in Europe help grow this mindset?
Well, here's the thing. I tend to think that one shouldn't always ask of ordinary people to be heroic, right? That's a lot to ask when so much is happening everywhere in the world. I think people can be heroic for short bursts in existential crises when they're personally under threat. But the whole point of representative democracy and democratic institutions is to allow people not to have to be heroic all the time. So we have to pay attention to the health, effectiveness, and legitimacy of our representative democracies that will allow people to deploy their energies, right, towards existential crises when that's necessary. And I say that because I think all of us in our own political spaces know where the machinery is creaking and where the wheels are coming off, right? And where we think that our communities are no longer holding together. I think if there's anything we've understood in the past few years, it is that not even the sole remaining superpower on this earth can act in an effective and credible and legitimate manner when its citizens are at each other's throats, or disagree with each other profoundly about what the truth is, right? Because that constrains the ability of governments to act abroad. So really, it does come back to us as citizens, right, to make sure that in our polities and in our representative democracies, things work. And very often, we can play a real personal role in that at the very local level, right? You can run for office in Washington, sure, you can run for Congress, but very often you can be
God
a city
help you.
councilman in Dallas, right?
God help you if you run for Congress.
Yeah, I actually just want to give one very compelling, I think, example of an answer to this, and it's actually a whole country, Finland. Because the Finns are really quite remarkable. I mean, I don't want to oversell the Finns too much. There's also not a lot of them, but maybe some of you here are descendants of Finns who moved to the United States. But the Finns really made a quite remarkable decision to join NATO after the invasion of Ukraine. And for all of the whole period after World War II, the Finns were pretty convinced they didn't need to do this because they thought that they could basically take care of everything themselves. Because the Finns, after being invaded by the Soviet Union in the Winter War, after, like Ukraine, getting their independence at the collapse of the Russian Empire, and then Stalin wanted to take them back again, almost 30 years on, from them getting their independence. I mean, again, a kind of a replay of this history. They fought back. Now, they lost territory. They actually did something very similar to what the Ukrainians had done in Kursk. They had actually their own incursion into Russian or Soviet territory. They lost that as well, but they gained their freedom. And what the Finns focused on for all of the intervening period before joining NATO was on building unity, building a really coherent, prosperous country where, you know, the Finns are notoriously polite. They're also the happiest country in the world, not just in Europe, according to all of the different polling. But they also were always prepared to fight. So the Ukrainians are doing this now, and the Finns actually told them early on, you're going to have to fight like we did. The Finns can actually field the largest reserve force in Europe. It's not just the Turks or the Brits, it's actually the Finns. They could get as many as 250,000 people under arms. All the way from the president to their ambassadors, all had a role to play in the event if the Russians invaded. Now, what the Finns are doing now in joining NATO is they're trying to get NATO to think like Finns, to think about resilience. And it also goes societal resilience, not just military resilience. And the former Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, who was one of the longest serving post-war presidents, is working with the head of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, on a resilience program for Europe, to get them to think about all of Europeans to think about all of the issues that Constanze is laying out. It wouldn't be a bad way for us to also think about being Finns, to think about societal resilience and also just being kind of willing to fight for what we believe in. And again, the Finns are unfailingly polite. When we were over, when I was there with the government, they said at one point they warned us there might be a small Finnish protest against the Americans visiting. And it was just a couple of placards, that were held up, and the Finns were just otherwise waving American flags with a few placards in Finnish that we couldn't actually read that were apparently, signs of protest. But the Finns, really mean business. And I think they're actually a really good example of a country that's grasped what's going on in the world, wants to play their role, but is also prepared to defend themselves and to, try to push things forward and help everybody else out as well.
I love it. Be like a Finn.
Like a Finn.
Polite, but ready.
But fearless.
Well, this has
Politely
been
fearless.
absolutely terrific. What a great evening, and what an important topic. A round of applause for these terrific panelists.
Well, I just want to thank you for your analysis and giving us a really holistic view of how critical this topic is. It's obviously important. It's why we're doing a series. This is part 1 of the series. Come to the next 2 that start on October 1st. Go to our website to check that out at dfwworld.org. I just want to say thank you to Dallas Baptist University for having us in this special space, beautiful space. Thank you to the Brookings Institution. Thank you to the Bush Institute. Thank you to the Dallas Morning News. And thanks to all of you. We are selling Fiona Hill's latest book right over here after the program, so please do pick up a copy. There is nothing for you here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. We'd love for you to pick up a copy, and thanks again. We'll see you soon.